Are you self-employed? Don't think you need business insurance? Think again. Business insurance from Zensurance is a no-brainer for every business owner because it provides peace of mind. A lot can go wrong. A fire, stolen equipment, or an unhappy customer suing you. That's why you need insurance. Don't let the "I'm too small for this" mindset hold you back from protecting yourself. Zensurance provides customized business insurance policies starting at just $19 per month. Visit Zensurance.com today and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance, mind your business.
I'm Abby Sharp, and I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to dismantle diet culture. Yes, that insidious multi-billion-dollar business keeping us on a never-ending hamster wheel of hating our bodies, fearing food, and spending our hard-earned money on a seemingly impossible mission to live our best, or more accurately, thinnest lives. On my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be using my signature science and sass to debunk myths, call out the charlatans, and take down the endless barrage of BS bombarding us every day. Tune in each week as I'm joined by guests for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and science-backed information to help you leave diet culture behind for good. Listen on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production.
Would Russia really drop a nuclear bomb on Ukraine?
Moscow now says it reserves the right to use its nuclear deterrent to respond to aggression from any non-nuclear state if it's supported by a nuclear state. I mean, this is ratcheting up the rhetoric. Whether or not this is just propaganda remains to be seen.
What is Russia's nuclear doctrine? And why did Putin change it this week?
Despite multiple rattlings of the nuclear saber by Putin and others, there's never been a redeployment of Russian nuclear forces. I'm not saying you don't take it seriously, but if Putin can outbluff us, he gets what he wants for free.
Was it a good idea for Joe Biden to give Ukraine American missiles to attack Russia?
6 missiles, they say, were fired at a military facility in Bryansk. That's another region on the border area, not far away from Kursk, which currently has a significant Ukrainian military presence inside of it. Now, the Russians claim that they took out 5 of those 6.
And what role does Canada play in this conflict?
We're continuing to engage closely with Zelensky and with Ukrainians. I think it's a good thing that there are conversations around this, but the level of trust that I have for Vladimir Putin is probably at an all-time low right now.
It has now been more than 1,000 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. Where does the war stand now? And what will happen next? I'm David Smith. This is The Big Story. Professor Elliot Tepper is Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. Hi, Professor.
Good morning, David.
Very nice to hear from you again. Thank you for taking the time today. So, I want to start with the big, scary headline first, and then we'll unpack the rest of the story. How realistic is the possibility of a nuclear strike in Ukraine? President Vladimir Putin has updated Russia's nuclear doctrine just 2 days after Joe Biden granted Ukraine permission to use U.S. missiles to strike targets deep inside Russia. Under this updated doctrine, Moscow will now consider aggression from any non-nuclear state with the participation of a nuclear state, like the U.S., as a joint attack on Russia. So a Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, explained to reporters this week that this means, quote, the Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression using conventional weapons against it and or the Republic of Belarus, end quote. So, Professor, we'll start at the top. What is this nuclear doctrine, and would Russia really use an atomic weapon against Ukraine?
We have to note that we have just passed 1,000 days since the Russians began this illegal attempt to basically eliminate Ukraine as a state and to integrate it into the Russian motherland. So we're at the 1,000-day mark. And throughout that, and indeed even before the actual invasion, Russia has tried to shape the response of the West, and particularly the U.S., by threatening nuclear war. They have the world's largest holding of nuclear weapons. The U.S. is second. Between them, they have 88% of the world's nuclear holding. So this is really you're quite right to start at the top saying this is the big scary thing. So Russia did seize Ukraine, remember, in 2014, and then tried to take the rest of the country. What this new doctrine says is that this time, what you've done, we really do want you to take seriously the possibility we're going to use nuclear weapons, because the earlier doctrine wasn't clear enough that we would do so, only in case of the threat to the existence of the state of Russia.
Right. So just to be clear,
Sure.
the update to the nuclear doctrine, it's not automatic. It's not binding. Russia's not compelled to launch a nuclear attack just because they've updated this doctrine. Is that right?
That's correct. They're saying they could, they might, and you'd better be sure that you realize that we might. But what this really does is lower the threshold, telling the world we're lowering the threshold. This time we might actually use nuclear weapons. So that's the nutshell of that. The nuclear temperature of the world just went up another notch.
How realistic is it? Is it possible to say right now with any degree of certainty whether it's realistic we could see a nuclear weapon deployed in Europe?
One never knows. The possibility that if Russia is actually threatened with loss, they might actually lose Crimea, for example. Many thresholds have been crossed, including this most recent one, whereby the West says, okay, we won't do this. Now we will provide this lethality, enhanced degrees of lethality, and Russia never does respond. But we're talking here about a huge nuclear bluff.
A huge nuclear bluff. Okay, let's put a pin in that and move on now as we go down the pyramid of the news from this week on the issue of missiles. Army Tactical Missile System, people may have heard the term in the media, ATACMS. That's what these things are called. They are U.S.-made long-range missiles, state-of-the-art. They can travel on the back of a truck, very mobile. They can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away. This week, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use them in Russian territory for the first time. Ukraine has done so. They launched an attack earlier this week. So what is the significance of that change in policy from the U.S. right now?
But this is precisely what has, so to speak, triggered the change in the nuclear doctrine, or at least the announcement of the change of the nuclear doctrine that we've just been discussing. For the first time, the weapons that the West have been providing, the U.S. and NATO allies have been providing to Ukraine, have always had this restriction that could only be used inside the territory of Ukraine. Now they can be used up to 300K outside, that is in the staging areas surrounding Ukraine, where Russia has many targets, because they are brutalizing Ukraine with their forces unrestricted, because until now, Ukraine could not directly strike them with Western supplied weapons, and the change is what has led to this announcement. We should add to this, however, that they've been using their own weapons increasingly effectively, particularly drones, to attack far deeper than the 300K inside Russia. So this is an attempt to push Russia back away from the immediate border area around Ukraine, and to give Ukraine more breathing room from the Russian aggression.
Do you think that we learned recently that North Korea has now actually sent troops into Russia to help with this? Do you think this move from the Biden administration may be related to that?
Yes, the question came, why the change now? Because until now, as we've seen, the Biden administration will provide increasing levels of lethality and different, increasingly capable weapons, but only in stages and only after a long delay. Why would they change this fundamental feature? No, you cannot fire directly into Russia, only on your own territory. Why would they do it now? Well, the reason is this startling move to actually bring combat troops, elite combat troops from North Korea into the Kursk region. The Kursk region is an oblast, a district inside Russia. August the 6th, in a lightning strike, Ukraine actually invaded Russia and has been holding that territory, David, ever since. Now, with the massing of those troops, up to 50,000 have been announced, including perhaps 10,000 North Korean troops to retake that, that indeed may be the precise reason that at this moment that restriction was lifted by the Biden administration. And also, by the way, France and the United Kingdom are contemplating doing the same thing. They have some very powerful cruise missiles that have been provided to Ukraine, but only inside Ukrainian territory. That might change the thinking in Russia a bit.
Ah, small business owner. So you wish to be at one with your enterprise. First, you must attain inner peace of small business insurance. This is Zensurance.
If you're self-employed, an entrepreneur, or a contractor, peace of mind is just a click away at Zensurance.com, Canada's leading source for small business insurance. It's quick, easy, and affordable. Get an instant price today at Zensurance.com.
That happens.
Okay, I want to ask you about another buzz term that's been all over the media and all of the headlines recently, and the word is escalation.
Right.
There's a lot to unpack behind that word, escalation, and a lot of it comes down to bluffing, as you've already mentioned. So how should we be thinking about this fear that the Biden administration's policy shift may make the war worse?
Well, let's back up. Escalation has entirely been on the Russian side from the beginning. There's a really black irony in the announcement by Russia that they will defend with this new announcement of the nuclear doctrine, their territorial integrity and their national sovereignty when they have invaded a neighboring state. This is old-fashioned Russian imperialism, precisely to break the 77-year ban on that sort of behavior, changing the national boundaries and the territorial sovereignty of a neighboring state by brute force. So they have been the ones escalating this from the very beginning. The response has been in stages over time in order to let the Ukrainians, with their bravery and their ingenuity and their loss of lives, not Western loss of lives, defend what is, after all, their own country. So the escalation, I think, has always been used against increasing assistance to Ukraine, against the escalation by Russia.
Okay, that leads us very nicely into our next topic. After 1,000 days of war in Ukraine, there's a new elephant in the room, and his name is Donald Trump. The president-elect will take office in January. Over the course of the election campaign in the U.S., he has mused about cutting U.S. military aid to Ukraine entirely. He has said he's the only one who can end the war. He has said he will be able to end it in one day once he takes office. So based on what we know today about President Trump, about his relationship with Vladimir Putin, what is President Trump's strategy on Ukraine and U.S. foreign policy under his administration towards Ukraine? What is that going to look like?
He's been ambiguous. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been more explicit, and essentially it's to capitulate to Russia on Russia's terms. That is, force Ukraine to come to the table because the United States will no longer provide military support, will withhold financial support. The U.S., therefore, is in position to force Ukraine to the table. And what J.D. Vance has said, well, Russia will have to take territory. The Russians, the territory, they have about 20% right now of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine will have to give it up in exchange for Russia no longer brutalizing them. I mean, that's the essence of a possible deal. And we don't know quite what Russia has in mind. And very quickly on this, the ineptitude of the opposition parties in the U.S., that is the Democratic Party and those who want to continue support. Biden has been the leader. He brought together the coalition effectively against Russia, but in stages. 90% of American expenditure on Ukraine is done, David, inside the U.S., including in districts such as Matt Gaetz. So basically the U.S. is revitalizing its own industrial base with the money that's been promised for Ukraine. And with 1% of the total U.S. budget, 5% of the U.S. national defense budget, Ukraine has been holding off and basically dismantling the number one military power in the world, second only to the U.S. That is, the Russians have been forced into this situation. And now this ability to force a settlement does rest with the Trump administration, short-sightedly, I think. But keep in mind what we just talked about as well, the shocking invasion of Russia itself and the holding of territory by Ukraine around Kursk, and they've expanded that, by the way, does give a possibility, if there's going to be peace talk, to include that part of Russian territory in a swap for land for peace.
That is very interesting. So President Zelensky has said he thinks the war may come to a swifter end once Donald Trump is in power. What do you make of those comments? What is known about Vladimir Putin's posture towards negotiating an end to this conflict?
They've put forth their own 10-point peace plan, and they've held big international meetings to discuss them. They were mistakenly called summits for peace, but they were really European support, Western support, and Japanese support for Ukraine in its aggression. So, in its fight against the Russian aggression. Nobody has a good answer to the question you're raising. That the possibility that Ukraine will be forced to make territorial concessions in order to get peace, and what could, in their view, only be a temporary peace. Because remember, this happened before. In 2014, Russia took a major part of Ukraine, that is Crimea, and then they just regrouped and tried to take the whole rest, as we know, in a 5-day war. They hoped a 1-week war. That didn't work out, and we're into this long, drawn-out stalemate. But the fact is the people of Ukraine are being brutalized. They're suffering. They desperately do want peace, but they do not want to lose their sovereignty. And there's a real possibility that any peace talks would put their national sovereignty at risk.
Be honest. When was the last time you thought about your current business insurance policy? If your existing business insurance policy is renewing on autopilot each year without checking out Zensurance, you're probably spending more than you need. That's why you need to switch to low-cost coverage from Zensurance before your policy renews this year. Zensurance does all the heavy lifting to find a policy, covering only what you need, and policies start at only $19 per month. So if your policy is renewing soon, go to Zensurance.com and buy your policy online in just a few minutes. Zensurance. Mind your business.
Okay, let's move closer to home, on the home front. Canada is wrapped up in this conflict as well, of course, as all other G7 partners are. We've spent $20 billion over the last 3 years or so on various supports for Ukraine. What is Canada's role here?
Canada is deeply committed to the defense of Ukraine, and I think that likely to be any government of Canada that comes to power will see this as really defending a democratic country in the heart of Europe against a military aggression by Russia, an imperial war. Canada has played an active role, as you pointed out, in terms of the funding, but also played a diplomatic role in trying to find ways to seize Russian assets in the West and give that to Ukraine. So Canada's been a leader on the diplomatic side, and also, of course, is playing a very active role inside NATO. I think underappreciated in all the conversation that, we don't do enough for NATO support that Trump raises. Actually, we're playing a major role there. NATO has enhanced its military presence surrounding Russia, not as part of the war, but defending all of the states. And as we know, Finland and Sweden have dramatically, unexpectedly abandoned their official neutrality of long standing in order to join NATO. So NATO is a much larger place in terms of the Russian border, and Canada is leading the role in Latvia as part of that enhanced presence. So we are deeply committed to Ukrainian democracy and the defense of territorial integrity and national sovereignty. This is not going to be a world safe for Canada if we go back to a situation where big states do what they what they will and the small states suffer, to quote Thucydides.
If it comes to a peace talk, peace negotiations, would Canada have a role in those as well as some kind of intermediary? How do we fit into that equation?
So I don't think we're likely to play any active role in peace talks. I mean, we have a long tradition of peacekeeping, but I don't see in this particular situation a role for peacekeepers in the way that Canada has contributed. So I think our primary role here is to support Ukraine in its effort to maintain as much of its independence as possible against all the forces that are pressing against Ukraine, keeping in mind that if Putin wins this gamble, remember he lost this is Putin's folly. I mean, he invaded and thought he could have a 1-week war. He lost that. Now he said, no, I'll take the Donbass. He's not done that. If he lost the Crimea, it would be game over. If he uses nuclear weapons, it's entirely possible it would be game over for him. But if he wins this gamble, this would bring nuclear-armed Russia into the heart of Europe. That would change the geopolitics not only of Europe, but of the entire world. And that's the kind of thing that's at stake as we say we stand by Ukraine.
Okay, I'd like to close today, Professor Tepper, with some thoughts from you on NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. Russia's premise, one of Russia's premise for the invasion of Ukraine was that Ukraine was, it's a national security threat to Russia for Ukraine to be part of NATO or more aligned with the West. Various mouthpieces for the Russian regime will repeat this criticism that the West should never have even considered a path to membership for Ukraine. Ukraine's bid to become a part of NATO had made some progress in the second year of the war. Things obviously have changed, become more embedded now. Do you think it's still possible for Ukraine to join NATO?
Well, of course, this is a nonsensical argument by Russia. When they invaded in 2014, and when they re-invaded again 1,000 days ago, there was no possibility that Ukraine would be joining NATO. There was no path to NATO being discussed. The reason we're talking about it now is because of Russian aggression. The states surrounding Russia that joined NATO immediately after the end of the Cold War, they weren't pushed or shoved. They ran to join NATO because they are familiar with the nature of Russian imperialism, Russian aggression, Russia's desire to rebuild its empire, led by Mr. Putin now. So the possibility that, yes, as part of peace talks, there might be a pledge by Ukraine, no, we do not want a path to NATO, that might be imposed on them. But the fact is that NATO has been trying to integrate, without actual membership, Ukraine into the processes of NATO. There's a council, NATO-Ukrainian Council, which means Ukraine can actually bring issues to NATO. Individual member states of NATO on their own have been signing up bilateral defense pacts, 10-year pacts, with a number of the NATO states. So there is an attempt to provide some kind of protection for Ukraine against the future possibility of taking over the rest of Ukraine once the world has turned its back. So NATO is not likely to actually let the country in as long as there's currently a war, because that would mean NATO would be officially at war with NATO the day later. An attack on one would be an attack on all. But at the same time, they do want to hold out the possibility of some kind of security guarantees to at least be a hedge against further Russian imperialism.
Okay. Professor Tepper, thank you for your time today, as always.
Well, it's a great pleasure talking about these very serious issues with you, David.
Professor Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. And a reminder to listeners, we have a new great listening experience for you. You can hear the Big Story podcast on the Seeker app. The Seeker app, that's S-E-E-K-R, Seeker. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.